You sit in a cramped office in the Royal Geographical Society in London. The year is 1833, and before you lies a problem that has consumed the last 3 months of your life. Your name is James Rennell, though not the famous James Rennell who died in 1830. You're his nephew, named after your uncle and following reluctantly in his cartographic footsteps. The problem before you is a map, or rather 27 maps, all claiming to show the same region of Central Asia, all wildly disagreeing about what actually exists there. The maps come from different sources: British military surveyors working in India, Russian explorers pushing south from Siberia, Chinese officials guarding their western frontiers, and, most frustratingly, accounts from traders, pilgrims, and adventurers whose reliability ranges from meticulous to fantastical. Your job is to reconcile these contradictory sources into a single, authoritative map that the Society can publish. It's tedious work, the kind that involves countless hours of cross-referencing, calculating distances, accounting for different measurement systems, and trying to determine which sources are trustworthy. The region in question is the area north of India, encompassing what will later be called Tibet, parts of Kashmir, and the mountain ranges that separate the Indian subcontinent from the vast interior of Asia. It's politically sensitive territory. The British East India Company is expanding northward, the Russian Empire is expanding southward, and the Chinese Qing dynasty is trying to maintain control over territories it claims but doesn't effectively govern. Accurate maps aren't just academic exercises. They're tools of empire, documents that can justify territorial claims or military campaigns. You've been working methodically through the sources, establishing a framework of relatively certain features. The Himalayas are real, obviously. Multiple reliable sources confirm the existence of these massive mountains, though their exact heights and extents remain disputed. The major rivers, the Indus, the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, are well documented, at least in their lower reaches. Major cities and trade routes have enough corroborating evidence to place them with reasonable confidence. But then there are the anomalies, features that appear in some sources but not others. Mountains where valleys should be, lakes that exist in one account but are absent from another. And most troubling, place names that appear consistently across multiple sources, but refer to locations that no European has verifiably visited. Your uncle taught you to be suspicious of such names. They often indicated second-hand knowledge, rumors repeated until they calcified into apparent fact. One name appears with particular frequency: Shambhala. Sometimes spelled Shambhala, Shambhala, Shangri-La in some later corrupted versions. The sources disagree wildly about where it is. A Tibetan text you've had translated places it north of the river Sita, which might be the Tarim River, but could refer to several other waterways. A Mongol chronicle suggests it lies beyond the mountains of ice, which could mean anywhere in the Himalayas, or the Tian Shan, or even the Altai ranges. A third source, from a Buddhist monastery in Bhutan, describes it as a kingdom hidden in a valley that can only be found by those who are worthy, which is poetically useless from a cartographic perspective. What troubles you isn't just the geographic vagueness. You're accustomed to that when dealing with remote regions. What troubles you is the consistency of certain details. Multiple unconnected sources describe Shambhala as a center of learning, a place where knowledge is preserved, where scholars study texts that predate recorded history. They describe advanced astronomical observations, mathematical knowledge, an understanding of medicine beyond what exists in the surrounding regions. Some sources claim the rulers of Shambhala are immortal or impossibly long-lived, which you dismiss as obvious mythology. But strip away the supernatural elements, and you're left with repeated claims of an isolated, highly advanced civilization existing somewhere in Central Asia. Your rational mind tells you this is either a conflation of several real places, perhaps Buddhist monasteries known for scholarship, combined with garbled accounts of actual kingdoms, or pure fantasy, religious mythology that people have mistaken for geographic reality. But you found something that makes you hesitate to dismiss it entirely. 3 weeks ago, you discovered a journal in the Society's archives. It belonged to a British officer named George Bogle, who traveled to Tibet in 1774 as part of a diplomatic mission. Bogle died in 1781, and his journals were deposited with the Society, but never properly catalogued or published. You found them by accident while searching for information about Tibetan geography. Bogle's writing is careful, precise, the work of an educated man trying to record what he observed without embellishment. He describes the monasteries he visited, the officials he met, the trade goods he observed, the political situation he navigated. And then, almost as an afterthought, he records a conversation with a Tibetan monk who claimed to have traveled to a place he called the Hidden Kingdom as a young man. The monk's account is frustratingly vague about location. Bogle noted his own frustration repeatedly. But the monk described architectural features that Bogle found strange. Buildings constructed with stone blocks fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed, arranged in patterns that suggested astronomical alignments. He described libraries containing texts written in scripts he didn't recognize, despite being educated in multiple Asian writing systems. He described scholars who claimed their lineage of learning stretched back thousands of years, preserved unbroken through careful transmission from master to student. Bogle, being rational, questioned the monk carefully. How did he know these claims were true? Couldn't the scholars be exaggerating their antiquity? The monk's response, as Bogle recorded it, was simple. They showed me the stars and told me what I would see before I looked. They described the movements of planets that I cannot see with my naked eye, but that they track through instruments. They predicted an eclipse that occurred exactly as they said, down to the minute. Such knowledge is not invented. It is accumulated. Bogle didn't know what to make of this. He noted that the monk seemed honest, that his descriptions of other places he'd visited were accurate where Bogle could verify them. But an isolated kingdom with advanced astronomical knowledge, libraries of ancient texts, buildings constructed with sophisticated techniques? It seemed implausible. Bogle concluded that the monk had probably visited an important monastery and, through combination of misunderstanding and exaggeration, had transformed a real place into something more fantastic. You've been inclined to agree with Bogle's interpretation, except for one detail that you discovered last week. A detail that has kept you up late several nights, staring at your maps and wondering. You were cross-referencing astronomical data. This is part of establishing accurate coordinates, using observations of celestial bodies to determine latitude and longitude. The Royal Observatory at Greenwich has been collecting such data for over a century, and you have access to their records. You were looking for any astronomical observations made by explorers or surveyors in Central Asia that you could use to verify positions on your map. You found a report from a British surveyor named William Moorcroft, who traveled through the Western Himalayas in 1820. Moorcroft was meticulous about astronomical observations, taking measurements whenever possible to establish his position accurately. In his journal, he noted something curious. He encountered a group of Tibetan monks who were also observing the night sky. Being interested in astronomy himself, Moorcroft engaged them in conversation through an interpreter. The monks, according to Moorcroft, accurately predicted the position of Jupiter and Saturn for the coming months. This wasn't particularly remarkable. Such predictions were possible with tables that existed in various cultures. But then one of the monks mentioned, almost casually, that there were additional planets beyond Saturn that would eventually be discovered. The monk described them as slow-moving lights that cannot be seen with unaided eyes, but that follow the same laws as the visible planets. Moorcroft recorded this in 1820. Uranus had been discovered in 1781, so the existence of planets beyond Saturn was known. But Neptune wouldn't be discovered until 1846, 26 years after Moorcroft's conversation. And the monk had spoken of planets, plural, suggesting knowledge of more than just Neptune. This could be coincidence, or lucky guessing, or a mistranslation. But it lodged in your mind, connecting to Bogle's account of scholars who could predict celestial movements with unusual precision. What if there was a center of astronomical knowledge in Central Asia, preserving observational data and mathematical techniques from some earlier, more advanced period? You know this is speculation bordering on fantasy. You know that including unverified locations on a map published by the Royal Geographical Society would be professional suicide. But you can't quite bring yourself to dismiss the possibility entirely. Somewhere in those mountains, hidden in valleys that European explorers haven't reached, could there be communities preserving knowledge that the rest of the world has lost or never had? The question gnaws at you as you work. You establish your baseline map, the features you're confident about, the mountains and rivers and cities that multiple reliable sources confirm. You mark areas of uncertainty with appropriate notations. You include place names where evidence suggests something exists, even if you're not certain exactly what. And you find yourself hesitating over the region where your sources place Shambhala. There's clearly something there. Multiple sources from different cultures and time periods reference the same general area, describe similar features, use similar names. But what is it? A monastery? A small kingdom? A geographic feature that's been mythologized? Or something genuinely anomalous? A pocket of preserved knowledge in a region otherwise isolated from the scientific advances happening in Europe? Your supervisor at the society stops by your office late one afternoon. Sir John Barrow is in his 70s, a veteran of the second secretary to the Admiralty, and one of the founders of the Royal Geographical Society. He's reviewing the maps that will be published in the Society's next journal, and he wants to see your progress. You show him your work, explaining the challenges, the contradictory sources, the decisions you've made about what to include and what to omit. He nods approvingly at most of it. Then he notices your notations in the region north of Tibet. "What's this?" he asks, pointing to where you've marked Kingdom of Shambhala, location uncertain, multiple unverified sources, in small, careful letters. You explain about the recurring references, about Bogle's journal, about Moorcroft's astronomical observations. Barrow listens without interrupting, his face unreadable. When you finish, he's quiet for a long moment. "Remove it," he finally says. "The name, the notation, all of it. We publish maps based on verified observations, not on travelers' tales and monastery legends." "But sir, there's clearly something there. Multiple independent sources, multiple sources describing something they didn't actually see or couldn't accurately locate," Barrow interrupts. "You're a cartographer, Rennell. Your job is to map reality, not mythology. If someone eventually reaches this region and verifies the existence of a kingdom or monastery or whatever it might be, we'll add it then. Until then, it doesn't belong on our map." He's right, of course. This is how proper cartography works. Verification before publication. But as you carefully remove your notations, as you reduce that region of your map to blank space marked only as unexplored, You can't shake the feeling that you're erasing something real. That somewhere in those mountains there exists knowledge, communities, perhaps even individuals whose understanding of the world surpasses your own. And by not marking them on your map, you're not making them less real. You're just making them invisible to the people who read your maps. That night, you make a second copy of your map, identical to the official version except for one detail. In the region north of Tibet, in space that officially remains blank, you mark a small notation in pencil, easily erasable, but present. Shambhala, with a question mark, acknowledging uncertainty while preserving possibility. You keep this personal copy in your desk drawer. The official map, cleaned of speculation and properly professional, goes to the printers. The Royal Geographical Society publishes your map in their 1834 journal. It's well received, praised for its accuracy and its careful notation of uncertainties. Other cartographers use it as a reference. Military officers planning campaigns in the region consult it. And that blank space in the mountains north of Tibet remains blank on European maps for another 60 years, unmarked except for the words unexplored territory, a gap in knowledge that conceals whatever actually exists there. But the stories don't stop. If anything, they proliferate. More travelers return from Central Asia with accounts of mysterious monasteries, of scholars with unusual knowledge, of places that can't quite be pinpointed on maps, but that everyone seems to have heard about. Some accounts are clearly fabrications, adventure tales embellished for audiences hungry for exotic mysteries. Others are harder to dismiss, careful observations from reliable witnesses describing things they saw but couldn't explain. And sometimes, late at night in your office, you pull out your personal map and stare at that penciled question mark, wondering what really lies in that blank space, wondering if the real purpose of maps is to show what we know, or to remind us how much we still don't know, how many blank spaces remain where reality might be stranger than the legends suggest. You're 43 years old now, 9 years after you published your map, and you're standing in a dusty market in Srinagar, the summer capital of Kashmir. You're not supposed to be here. You're supposed to be in London, working on a revised edition of your Central Asia map, incorporating new survey data from British military expeditions. But 6 months ago, you received a letter that changed everything. The letter came from India, from a missionary named Alexander Choma de Kuros. You'd heard of Choma. He was somewhat famous in geographic circles as a Hungarian scholar who'd spent years traveling through Central Asia, ostensibly searching for the ancestral homeland of the Hungarian people. But actually, as far as you could tell, just wandering and studying whatever interested him. He'd learned Tibetan, lived in monasteries, studied Buddhist texts, existed on the margins of both European and Asian society, belonging fully to neither. Soma's letter was brief and peculiar. He wrote that he'd heard about your map, that he'd read your notes in the Society's journal about the difficulties of mapping the Tibetan region. He said he had information that might interest you, information about the location and nature of certain centers of learning that appear in local accounts but remain unverified by European observers. He invited you to visit him in Ladakh, where he was currently residing, if you were interested in discussing this further. The letter intrigued you enough that you requested a leave of absence from the Society. Officially, you're conducting field research to verify and update your map. Unofficially, you're chasing a question that has haunted you for 9 years, ever since you removed Shambhala from your published map. Soma isn't in Ladakh when you arrive. The monks at the monastery where he'd been staying tell you he's traveled south to Srinagar for the summer to escape the high-altitude winter. So you followed him here, to this crowded market where you're supposed to meet him at a tea house near the main bazaar. You find the tea house easily. It's exactly where the monks described. But Soma isn't there. You wait, drinking bitter tea, watching the market crowd flow past. Kashmiris, Tibetans, Ladakhis, the occasional European face, traders and pilgrims and soldiers, all mixing in this crossroads city where the Indian subcontinent meets Central Asia. After an hour, a man approaches your table. He's European, clearly, but dressed in local clothing, his skin weathered and dark from years of sun and wind. He's thin, almost gaunt, with intense eyes that suggest someone who spends too much time thinking and not enough time sleeping. "Renel?" he asks in English, heavily accented with Hungarian. "Soma?" He nods and sits without waiting for invitation. For a moment, neither of you speaks. You're trying to assess this strange man who has drawn you halfway across the world on the promise of information about blank spaces on maps. He seems to be assessing you equally carefully. "Thank you for coming," he finally says. "I wasn't certain you would." Most scholars prefer their studies to remain comfortably distant, conducted from libraries and archives rather than dusty markets. "I prefer accuracy to comfort," you reply, slightly defensive. "If there's information that would improve my maps, I want to know it." Soma nods slowly. "Then I must disappoint you immediately. I cannot show you Shambhala on a map. I cannot give you coordinates, measurements, verifiable observations that would satisfy the Royal Geographical Society. What I can offer is context, patterns, and a hypothesis that may help you understand what your sources are actually describing." He orders tea, and when it arrives, he speaks carefully, choosing words with the precision of someone operating in a non-native language. "For 12 years, I have traveled through this region. I have stayed in over 30 monasteries. I have studied with lamas, scholars, hermits. I have read texts that most Europeans don't know exist. And I have learned that there is a network, not a single place, but a network, of preserved knowledge distributed across Central Asia." He pauses, gauging your reaction. You say nothing, waiting for him to continue. "These are not grand institutions," he goes on. "They are small monasteries, remote hermitages, family lineages of scholars, sometimes just a single master and a handful of students. But they share texts. They preserve traditions. They maintain knowledge that is very, very old. Older than Buddhism in most cases. Pre-Buddhist knowledge that was absorbed into Buddhist institutions because the monasteries were the only structures that could preserve it." "What kind of knowledge?" you ask. "Astronomical, primarily. Mathematical, medical, linguistic. The kind of systematic observation and recording that requires stable institutions and unbroken transmission across generations. The monasteries provided that stability, even through periods of political chaos, military conquest, social upheaval. While empires rose and fell, these small communities kept copying texts, training students, maintaining observations." You're listening carefully, trying to separate fact from speculation. "And Shambhala?" Soma smiles slightly. "Shambhala is what happens when this network becomes mythologized. When people who don't understand the actual nature of what they're encountering, a distributed system of knowledge preservation, try to describe it as a single place. They hear about texts that are thousands of years old. They hear about scholars who can predict celestial events. They hear about lineages stretching back before memory. And they imagine a hidden kingdom, a center of power and wisdom, because that's easier to conceptualize than the reality. Which is, that knowledge can be preserved without empires, without grand institutions, without centralized authority. That a dozen monasteries scattered across mountain ranges, maintaining communication through traveling scholars and copied texts, can preserve more knowledge more reliably than the Library of Alexandria ever did. Shambhala isn't a place, it's a system. You sit with this, turning it over in your mind. It's simultaneously disappointing. No hidden kingdom, no mysterious center of ancient power, and fascinating. But the astronomical knowledge, Shuna, you say, thinking of Moorcroft's encounter, the predictions that proved accurate. How did they have that? Centuries of continuous observation, Soma replies. Think about it. These monasteries have existed in relative isolation for 1,000 years or more. They have stable locations, clear skies, motivated observers who see astronomical study as religious practice. They've been recording the movements of stars and planets every clear night for longer than any European institution has existed. They have data sets that make the Royal Observatory's century of records look insignificant. With that much data, patterns become visible that shorter observations miss. Planetary cycles, precession, phenomena that take decades or centuries to become apparent. They have records of all of it. Not because they're mystically advanced, but because they've been systematically observing for an absurdly long time. It makes sense, you realize. It explains the accounts without requiring anything supernatural or even particularly mysterious. Just institutional continuity and patient observation compounded across centuries. So there's no secret kingdom controlling world events, you say, half disappointed and half relieved. Soma hesitates, and you notice the hesitation immediately. That's not exactly what I said, he finally replies. I said Shambhala isn't a single place. I said the knowledge is distributed. But there is coordination, communication between these monasteries, decisions about what to preserve, what to share, what to keep hidden. Someone is maintaining this network, has been maintaining it for a very long time. Who? I don't know. I don't think there's a single person or even a single institution. More like a loose council, masters from different monasteries who meet occasionally, share information, make collective decisions. I've heard references to it, oblique mentions in texts, but nothing definite. The network exists, but its coordination is deliberately obscure. You lean back, processing this. Why are you telling me this? What do you want me to do with this information? Soma is quiet for a long moment, staring into his tea. When he speaks, his voice is softer, almost sad. I'm telling you because knowledge that isn't shared is fragile. These monasteries, this network, it's under threat. The British are expanding north. The Russians are pushing south. The Qing dynasty is collapsing. This whole region is about to become a battlefield in a great game between empires. And when that happens, remote monasteries full of old texts will not be priorities for anyone. Some of this knowledge needs to be preserved elsewhere, documented, copied, shared with institutions that might survive the coming upheaval. Not all of it. Some should remain with the lineages that have carried it for centuries. But some should be distributed more widely, made available to scholars who can appreciate it, learn from it, build on it. And you think I can help with that? You make maps, Soma says simply. Maps that people trust, that guide travelers and scholars. If you mark certain locations, note certain monasteries, include references to texts or observations available at specific sites, people will go there. Scholars, linguists, astronomers. And in going there, they'll create relationships, establish exchanges, help preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. You understand what he's asking now. Not to mark Shambhala on your map, not to identify some hidden kingdom, but to carefully document real places, real monasteries, real communities of scholars, bringing them into the network of European knowledge before political upheaval destroys them. It's practical, achievable, and it sidesteps entirely the question of secret societies controlling world events. But something in Soma's explanation bothers you. You said they're coordinating, you point out, making collective decisions. About what? Soma meets your eyes. About how to influence world events without controlling them. About how to preserve knowledge that might be dangerous in the wrong hands. About how to guide human civilization toward stability without ever appearing to guide it at all. That sounds like conspiracy theory. Does it? Soma asks mildly. What if I told you that certain texts in Tibetan monasteries predicted the fall of the Qing dynasty, the rise of European colonialism, the coming conflicts that will reshape Asia? What if I told you that scholars in these monasteries have been quietly encouraging certain political alliances, discouraging others, all based on centuries of accumulated wisdom about how societies collapse and how they can be stabilized? You stare at him. I'd say that's impossible to prove and unlikely to be true. Yes, Soma agrees. Exactly. Which is why it's such an effective strategy. Any influence so subtle that it appears to be chance. Any coordination so loose that it looks like coincidence. Any knowledge so old that it seems like mythology. None of it can be proven. None of it can be countered. All of it remains deniable. If Shambhala exists as a controlling force, that's exactly how it would operate. Not through armies or explicit power, but through preserved knowledge and patient influence, acting so slowly and subtly that no one ever realizes they're being guided. You don't know what to believe. Soma might be right. Might have discovered a genuine network of coordinated scholarship that has preserved ancient knowledge and used it to influence events. Or he might have gone slightly mad from too many years in isolation, connecting patterns that don't actually exist, seeing conspiracy where there's only coincidence. You have no way to determine which is true. What you can verify is more limited. The monasteries exist, the texts exist, the astronomical knowledge exists. Whether there's coordination beyond scholarly exchange, whether there's any deliberate influence on world events, these remain speculative. But even the verifiable parts are remarkable enough. A distributed network of knowledge preservation maintained for centuries through political upheaval and isolation, containing observations and texts that European scholars don't know exist. That, at least, you can document. That you can put on your maps, carefully and accurately, marking monasteries, noting collections, guiding future scholars to sites worth studying. It won't be dramatic. It won't expose any secret society or hidden kingdom. But it might help preserve something valuable. Might create connections between isolated communities and the wider world of scholarship. Might ensure that knowledge survives the political chaos that Soma believes is coming. I'll update my map, you tell him. I'll note the monasteries you tell me about, mark them as sites of scholarly interest. I can't make claims about their content without verifying it myself, but I can indicate where future researchers might find material worth studying. Soma nods, seeming satisfied. That's enough. That's all I'm asking. The rest, whether there's coordination, whether there's influence, whether Shambhala exists as anything more than a network of patient scholars, that you can decide for yourself, or not decide. Sometimes the most important knowledge is knowing that you don't know, that the world contains blank spaces that might be hiding something extraordinary, or might be hiding nothing at all. He stands to leave, then pauses. One more thing. The texts I've studied suggest that this network, if it exists, has one primary concern: preventing the kind of catastrophic knowledge loss that has happened repeatedly throughout human history. Libraries burned, texts destroyed, lineages interrupted. They're trying to ensure that certain knowledge, astronomical, medical, mathematical, survives no matter what political or social upheavals occur. If that's true, if they really are coordinating to preserve knowledge, then they're not controlling world events so much as preparing for them, making sure that when empires fall and cities burn and civilizations collapse, as they always do eventually, someone somewhere still knows how to track the stars, heal the sick, calculate eclipses. That's not sinister control. That's insurance against human destructiveness. Soma leaves, disappearing into the market crowd, and you sit alone with your tea and your thoughts. You came here hoping for clear answers, for definitive information you could use to complete your map. What you got instead is a hypothesis you can't fully prove or disprove, a suggestion that blank spaces on maps might conceal not hidden kingdoms, but something potentially more significant. Networks of preserved knowledge, patient coordination spanning centuries, influence so subtle it appears to be none at all. You think about how you'll update your map, not with Shambhala, marked dramatically in unexplored territory, but with careful notations about real monasteries, real collections of texts, real communities of scholars. Small marks that most readers will barely notice, that won't make your map famous or controversial, but that might guide a few future researchers to places where remarkable knowledge has been preserved against all odds. And you wonder, as you walk back through the market toward your lodgings, whether that's how real influence works. Not through dramatic revelations or obvious control, but through small, patient actions. A monastery built in a strategic location, a text copied and preserved, a map marked with a notation that seems insignificant, but that guides future scholars to where knowledge waits. Influence so gradual and subtle that by the time its effects become visible, no one remembers the original actions that started the chain of causation. If Shambhala exists, maybe that's its true nature. Not a hidden kingdom pulling strings, but a distributed network making small, careful choices that compound across centuries into something that shapes civilization without ever appearing to control it. And maybe that's the most unsettling possibility of all. Not that there's a secret cabal controlling world events, but that there's a loose coordination of patient scholars guiding humanity so subtly that we think we're making our own choices, following our own paths, when actually we're being nudged, gently and almost invisibly, toward outcomes that were foreseen and prepared for centuries ago. Or maybe Soma is just wrong, sees patterns where none exist, and you're overthinking a simple case of isolated monasteries that happen to have old texts and patient scholars. You don't know. The blank spaces on your map will remain blank, marked only with small notations that future researchers can investigate or ignore as they choose. And whether those notations will lead to discovery or disappointment, whether Shambhala is real or mythology, whether the world is subtly guided or simply chaotic, these questions will outlive you, unanswered, waiting in the spaces between what's known and what's speculated, where all the most interesting mysteries reside. You are cold. This is not unusual. You've been cold for most of the past 6 years, ever since you arrived in Lhasa in 1887 as a translator attached to a British diplomatic mission that was barely tolerated and constantly surveilled. Your name is Sarat Chandra Das, and you are perhaps the most unlikely spy the British Empire has ever employed, which is exactly why you've been effective. You were born in Bengal, educated in Sanskrit and Bengali, trained as a schoolteacher, and recruited into intelligence work almost by accident. The British needed someone who could travel in Tibet without immediately appearing to be a British agent. Someone who could speak local languages, understand Buddhist texts, navigate the complex social hierarchies of Tibetan monasteries. You fit these requirements, though you had no particular desire for adventure or espionage. You needed the money. Your family needed the money. The British offered enough that you couldn't refuse. So here you are, ostensibly studying Buddhist philosophy at a monastery in Lhasa, actually compiling intelligence reports about Tibetan politics, Russian influence, trade routes, anything that might be militarily or commercially useful to the British Raj. It's tedious work, mostly, requiring more patience than courage. You sit in cold libraries, copy texts, make careful notes, cultivate relationships with monks who might share information without realizing what they're sharing. The cold is constant. The altitude makes every task exhausting. The food is adequate but monotonous. You miss India with an intensity that sometimes surprises you. Today, however, is different. Today, you're being shown something that few outsiders have ever seen. And you're not entirely sure why you've been granted this privilege. The abbot of your monastery, a man named Sering, who has been cautiously friendly despite clearly understanding that you're more than a simple scholar, has invited you to the monastery's restricted library. This is not the public collection where you've been working for the past months. This is the private archive, the texts that are considered too sensitive, too powerful, or too sacred for general access. The library is a single room, smaller than you expected, lined with shelves holding perhaps 200 volumes. Not a vast collection, but clearly carefully curated. The texts are in various languages and scripts, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Chinese, and others you don't immediately recognize. Some appear ancient, their pages dark with age. Others are clearly newer copies, the script still bold and clear. Tsering watches you take in the room, then speaks in Tibetan. You've been respectful of our traditions. You've studied diligently. You've not asked questions about matters that don't concern you. This has been noted. You bow slightly, acknowledging the compliment while wondering where this is leading. Tsering continues. There are things in this room that relate to your country's interests. Not military information, we have none of that. But historical knowledge, texts that describe events your scholars might find interesting. I'm going to show you one such text. What you do with that knowledge is your choice. He moves to a shelf and removes a volume bound in dark leather, its pages protected by wooden covers. He places it carefully on a reading table and opens it to a marked page. The text is in Sanskrit, which you can read fluently, though the script is archaic, requiring concentration to parse. This was copied here 180 years ago, Tsering explains. The original was much older, perhaps 1,000 years or more. It describes a network of scholars and monasteries that existed before Buddhism became the dominant religion in this region. A network dedicated to preserving knowledge through political upheavals, invasions, the rise and fall of kingdoms. You begin reading. The text is a kind of chronicle listing names, locations, dates. It describes a council of scholars who met periodically to decide which texts should be copied, which knowledge should be prioritized, where new monasteries should be established to ensure geographic distribution of important information. It mentions specific astronomical observations, medical texts, mathematical treatises, all being deliberately preserved and distributed. What strikes you most is the organizational sophistication. This wasn't casual knowledge sharing. It was systematic, strategic, with clear priorities and methods. The text describes how multiple copies of important works were maintained in different locations to prevent total loss if one monastery was destroyed. It details how traveling scholars were used to maintain communication between distant sites. It even discusses criteria for selecting students who would be trained in preservation techniques, in copying methods, in the languages needed to work with texts from different regions. This network, you say slowly, looking up at Tsering. Did it continue? Does it still exist? Tsering's expression is carefully neutral. That's not a question I can answer. But I can tell you that the principles described in this text, geographic distribution of knowledge, multiple copies, systematic preservation, careful selection of students, these principles remain valuable. Any institution concerned with preserving knowledge across long time periods would adopt similar methods. You understand what he's not saying. Whether there's still an organized network coordinating these efforts, he won't confirm or deny. But the principles endure, embedded in how Tibetan monasteries operate, how texts are maintained, how knowledge is transmitted. The network might have formalized structure or might simply be a set of practices so ingrained in institutional culture that coordination happens without needing explicit organization. Why show me this, you ask? Tsering is quiet for a moment before responding. Because your empire is expanding. Because railroads and telegraphs and modern administration are spreading across Asia. Because the old ways of preserving knowledge, isolated monasteries, carefully copied texts, lineages of oral transmission, are becoming vulnerable to forces that don't understand their value and won't protect them when they're in the way of progress. Some of this knowledge needs to be shared with your scholars, documented in your libraries, translated into your languages. Not all of it. Some should remain with us, within traditions that have protected it for centuries. But some needs to be distributed more widely, made accessible to institutions that have resources we lack, preservation methods we haven't developed. If your empire is going to reshape Asia, it should at least benefit from the accumulated wisdom of the civilizations it's disrupting. It's the most direct political statement Tsering has ever made to you, and you recognize it as significant. He's not asking you to spy. He's asking you to be a bridge, to facilitate knowledge transfer before political upheaval makes it impossible. It's a reasonable request, even from a British intelligence perspective. The more you understand about the region's intellectual heritage, the better you can administer it, or at least that's how you'll justify it in your reports. I can arrange for translations, you say carefully. I can ensure that texts you consider appropriate for sharing reach British scholars who will treat them with respect. But I need to understand something first. This network, these preserved texts, is there any political purpose? Any attempt to influence British policy or Russian expansion or Chinese control? Are these monasteries coordinating in ways that have strategic implications? Tsering smiles slightly, as if he expected this question. If I said yes, would you believe me? If I said no, would you believe that? The truth is more complicated than yes or no. These monasteries don't coordinate military actions or political conspiracies, but they do preserve knowledge that has political implications. Texts about governance, about how empires collapse, about which policies lead to stability and which to chaos. When lamas advise nobles, when abbots counsel government officials, this knowledge informs their advice. Is that political coordination? Or just educated people applying historical wisdom to current problems? You see his point. The line between preserving political knowledge and engaging in political coordination is thin, perhaps non-existent. If a monastery's library contains detailed histories of failed empires, And if scholars study those histories and draw conclusions about current policies, and if those scholars then advise officials who make decisions, is that a conspiracy? Or is it just how knowledge naturally influences human affairs? I'll report accurately on what I learn, you tell Sering. I'll facilitate the translations you want made. But I can't guarantee how British officials will interpret this information. If they see political threat, they may act to suppress rather than preserve. I understand, Sering replies. But the alternative is to share nothing, preserve nothing, and watch as political upheaval destroys texts that have survived for centuries because no one thought to distribute them more widely. Some risk is preferable to certain loss. Over the following weeks, you work in the restricted library, cataloging texts that Sering has approved for documentation. Many are astronomical. Detailed observations going back hundreds of years, predictions of eclipses and planetary movements calculated with remarkable accuracy. Others are medical, describing treatments derived from systematic experimentation, cataloging which herbs and procedures produce which results. Still others are historical, chronicling the rise and fall of kingdoms, analyzing the factors that led to stability or collapse. You copy selected passages, take careful notes, prepare translations that you'll eventually send to Calcutta. The work is painstaking and often tedious. But gradually, a picture emerges of how knowledge has been preserved and transmitted across this region for over a millennium. And what you discover is both more mundane and more impressive than stories of secret societies would suggest. There's no single controlling organization, no council of immortal masters pulling strings. Instead, there's a distributed network of monasteries that have over centuries developed sophisticated methods for preserving knowledge. They copy texts systematically, maintain multiple versions in different locations, train specialists in preservation techniques, use traveling scholars to share information and maintain communication. They prioritize certain types of knowledge, astronomical, medical, historical, that have practical value for human welfare and that can be lost if a single lineage is broken. The immortals of legend turn out to be something more interesting than literal eternal life. They're lineages of teaching that have remained unbroken for centuries. A master trains students. One student becomes the next master, trains more students, and the chain continues. The knowledge is immortal, preserved and passed forward, even as individual humans age and die. The lineage doesn't age, doesn't forget, accumulates observations and refinements across generations. That's the immortality, not of bodies, but of systematic knowledge. But you also find hints of coordination that goes beyond simple scholarly exchange. References in texts to council decisions about which monasteries should focus on which types of knowledge. Mentions of approved copying lists that prioritize certain texts over others. Notes about traveling scholars being sent to specific locations because balance requires strengthening the eastern nodes. Or, the southern texts need to be compared with northern versions. This suggests something more organized than independent monasteries happening to share interests. Someone is making strategic decisions about knowledge distribution. Someone is thinking systematically about how to preserve information across geography and time. Whether this rises to the level of secretly controlling world events seems doubtful. You find no evidence of political manipulation or military coordination. But there's clearly intentional management of an intellectual network, decisions being made about what knowledge matters most and how to protect it. One evening, Sering finds you in the library, studying a particularly puzzling text. It's a chronicle of council meetings going back 300 years, listing decisions made about knowledge preservation but frustratingly vague about who attended these councils or where they were held. You're trying to determine if there's centralized control, Tsering observes. Yes, you admit. There's no point in pretending otherwise. And you haven't found clear evidence either way, he continues. No. The texts suggest coordination, but don't prove it. They could be describing loose consensus among independent monasteries. Or they could be evidence of organized direction. I can't tell which. Tsering nods. That ambiguity is intentional. If there is coordination, and I'm not confirming that there is, but if there were, it would be designed to be deniable. Visible enough to function, subtle enough to avoid becoming a target. Any network trying to preserve knowledge through centuries of political upheaval would need to be simultaneously present and invisible. That sounds like conspiracy, you point out. Does it? Consider this. Individual monasteries are vulnerable. They can be destroyed, libraries burned, lineages broken. But a distributed network with multiple copies of important texts and communication between nodes, that's robust. Even if several monasteries are destroyed, knowledge survives in others. That's not conspiracy. That's intelligent system design. But someone has to design the system. Someone has to coordinate the network. Does someone? Tsering asks. What if it emerged organically? Monasteries naturally share texts, naturally send traveling scholars, naturally notice when certain knowledge is at risk, and naturally take steps to preserve it. Over centuries, these natural behaviors could create patterns that look like coordination without requiring central control. The appearance of design without a designer. The functionality of organization without the vulnerability of hierarchy. You realize he's describing something that could be interpreted multiple ways, and that the interpretation matters less than the function. Whether there's a secret council or just emergent patterns of behavior, the result is the same. Knowledge is being preserved systematically across a distributed network that survived political upheavals that destroyed more centralized institutions. Should Britain be concerned about this? You ask directly. Is there any threat to imperial interests in these knowledge networks? Tsering considers the question carefully. That depends on what Britain values. If empire is about control, about imposing a single system on diverse peoples, then yes, these networks might be concerning. They represent alternative sources of authority, alternative ways of organizing human knowledge and society. They can't be easily controlled or suppressed because they're distributed and adaptive. But if empire is about prosperity, stability, and human welfare, then these networks are assets. They preserve knowledge that could help Britain govern more effectively, understand local conditions better, avoid mistakes that previous rulers made. Thus, historical texts alone contain case studies of what policies work and which lead to rebellion and collapse. That's valuable information for any administration. You understand his argument, and it's one you can present to your superiors. Frame the knowledge networks as resources rather than threats, emphasize their utility for colonial administration, suggest that supporting them serves British interests. It's not entirely honest. You suspect these networks do pose a subtle challenge to imperial control, precisely because they provide alternative sources of wisdom and authority that don't depend on British approval. But it's an argument that might protect them while you facilitate the knowledge transfer Tsering wants. Over the next year, you continue your work, slowly compiling a comprehensive report on Tibetan knowledge preservation systems. You send translations of selected texts to Calcutta, where they're received with interest, if not full understanding. British scholars are impressed by the astronomical observations, intrigued by the medical knowledge, mostly indifferent to the historical and philosophical material. But you also notice something troubling. As more European travelers penetrate Tibet, as British and Russian interests collide in the region. The monasteries are becoming more cautious, more protective of their libraries. Tsering tells you that some abbots wanted to deny you continued access to the restricted library, that they're concerned about knowledge being extracted and used against them. He personally vouched for you, but he can't guarantee that access will continue. The window is closing, he tells you one cold morning in 1893. Soon this region will be engulfed in what you call the Great Game, the competition between empires. When that happens, monasteries will be viewed as either assets to be controlled or obstacles to be removed. The knowledge we've preserved for centuries will be at risk. What can I do? You ask, and you mean it sincerely. You've come to respect these institutions, to appreciate the patient work of preservation they've maintained across generations. Finish your documentation, Tsering says. Make sure that the knowledge we've shared with you reaches institutions that will preserve it. Create copies, distribute them. Ensure that even if our libraries burn, some portion of what we've maintained will survive in your museums and universities. It's not ideal. We'd prefer to keep everything here, within the traditions that created and maintained it. But survival is more important than preference. You work with increased urgency after that conversation. You complete your cataloging, finish your translations, compile your reports. In 1893, you leave Tibet, returning to India with trunks full of notes, copies, translations. You deposit some material with the Asiatic Society of Bengal, send other texts to the British Museum, distribute copies to universities in Calcutta and Cambridge. You ensure that the knowledge networks of Tibet, whether they represent conscious coordination or emergent patterns, have at least partially succeeded in their goal. Preserving knowledge by distributing it, making it accessible to institutions that will outlast any single monastery. But you also wonder often about what you couldn't document. The texts Tsering didn't show you, the knowledge kept too sensitive to share, the coordination methods that remain deliberately obscure. If there really is a network consciously managing knowledge preservation, what else are they managing? What other forms of subtle influence have they developed over centuries? And most troubling, if they're sophisticated enough to design deniable coordination, sophisticated enough to preserve knowledge through centuries of upheaval, what else might they be capable of? You think about this, especially when reading the historical texts you translated, the ones analyzing how empires collapse. They describe patterns with disturbing precision: overextension of resources, breakdown of communication, loss of legitimacy, internal divisions exploited by external enemies. They read less like historical analysis and more like diagnostic manuals, guides for identifying symptoms of imperial decline. And you wonder if the scholars who wrote these texts, who preserved them, who study them in their cold libraries high in the mountains, do they use this knowledge passively, just understanding the patterns? Or do they use it actively, identifying vulnerable points in existing empires, knowing where small pressures might accelerate inevitable declines? You'll never know for certain. The reports you file with British intelligence are factual, careful, emphasizing the intellectual value of what you discovered while downplaying any suggestions of coordinated political activity. You frame the monasteries as resources for colonial administration rather than potential threats. It's the best you can do to protect institutions you've come to value while fulfilling your obligations to the empire that employed you. But late at night, in your house in Darjeeling, where you retire after your Tibet years, you sometimes think about Tsering's careful words, his strategic ambiguity, his refusal to confirm or deny coordination. And you think about how effective that ambiguity is. If the monasteries really are coordinating, if there really is intentional management of a knowledge network, If they really are applying their preserved wisdom to influence current events, they've made it impossible to prove. Every piece of evidence can be interpreted as either conscious design or organic emergence. Every act of influence can be explained as either calculated intervention or natural result of educated people applying historical knowledge. It's the perfect defense, apparent conspiracy that can't be distinguished from coincidence, coordination that looks like independent action, influence that seems like education. If Shambhala exists as an organized network secretly shaping events, it's operating exactly as your experience suggests it would, visibly enough to function, subtly enough to remain deniable, patient enough that its influence compounds across decades and centuries until effects become visible long after causes are forgotten. Or maybe it's all fantasy, patterns imposed on randomness by humans, desperate to find order in chaos. Maybe Sering was just a well-educated abbot trying to preserve his monastery's library, and you've constructed elaborate theories from minimal evidence. Maybe the Immortals of Shambhala are just patient scholars doing the unglamorous work of copying texts and training students, generation after generation, without any grand coordination or secret influence. You don't know. You'll never know. And perhaps that uncertainty is itself revealing. That the most sophisticated forms of influence are precisely those that remain ambiguous, that can never be definitively proven or disproven, that exist in the space between possibility and confirmation, where speculation flourishes, but knowledge remains elusive. You are standing in a valley that officially doesn't exist, or at least that's what your Soviet superiors would prefer. The year is 1958, and you are Dr. Alexei Volkov, a geologist working for the Soviet Academy of Sciences on a mineral survey expedition in the Altai Mountains, on the border between Soviet territory and Chinese Xinjiang. Your job is to locate potential uranium deposits, rare earth elements, anything that might be strategically valuable to the Soviet nuclear program. It's unglamorous work, involving long days of hiking, taking samples, analyzing rocks, and filing reports that mostly say, "Nothing significant found here." Today, however, is different. You found something that makes no geological sense, and you're not sure what to do about it. The valley is narrow, accessible only through a gap in the surrounding cliffs that you only discovered by accident when bad weather forced you to seek shelter. Once inside, you found yourself in a space perhaps 2 kilometers long and half a kilometer wide, completely enclosed by steep rock walls. The valley floor is relatively flat, with a small stream running through it, and the climate inside is noticeably warmer than the surrounding area, probably due to the sheltering effect of the cliffs. None of that is particularly unusual. What's unusual are the structures. They're ruins, clearly, weathered and partially collapsed, but unmistakably artificial. Stone walls forming rectangular enclosures, the remains of what might have been buildings or fortifications. Pathways worn into the rock, and most puzzling of all, what appears to be a stone platform with carved marks that could be writing or could be decorative patterns. You're not qualified to judge. You're a geologist, not an archaeologist. Your expertise is in rocks and minerals, not human history. But you know enough to recognize that these structures are old, very old, and that they shouldn't be here. The official histories of this region describe it as sparsely populated throughout recorded history, inhabited only by nomadic herders who left no permanent settlements. Yet here you are, standing amid clear evidence of a substantial settled community that someone built and someone occupied. At some point in the past that you can't determine, but that the weathering suggests was a very long time ago. Your first thought is to report this immediately. Significant archaeological finds are supposed to be documented and reported to appropriate authorities. But then you remember where you are. In a sensitive border region, conducting work related to nuclear weapons development. In a political climate that doesn't reward curiosity about matters outside your assigned scope. Reporting this could lead to questions about why you were exploring off your assigned survey route. Could trigger an archaeological investigation that would interfere with your mineral survey. Could draw attention to this valley that someone might prefer to remain unnoticed. Your second thought is to ignore it. Take your samples and leave. What you don't report doesn't exist as far as official records are concerned. The ruins have been here for centuries or millennia. They'll continue to be here whether you document them or not. Why complicate your life? But you're a scientist, and scientists document what they observe. That's the fundamental principle of the profession. So you compromise. You'll document it for yourself, take photographs, make notes, collect samples for dating if you ever get the opportunity to analyze them properly. You won't file an official report, but you won't ignore it either. You'll preserve the information and decide later what to do with it. You spend the afternoon photographing the ruins from multiple angles, sketching rough maps of the layout, taking samples of the stone used in construction. The carved platform particularly interests you. The marks are definitely intentional, arranged in patterns that suggest linguistic or mathematical content. You photograph them carefully, knowing that someone with appropriate expertise might be able to interpret them, even if you cannot. As you work, you notice other curious features. The valley's microclimate is more unusual than you initially realized. The temperature is significantly warmer than it should be at this altitude and latitude. You check your thermometer multiple times, thinking it must be malfunctioning. But it consistently reads 8 to 10 degrees Celsius, warmer than the temperature just outside the valley entrance. There's no obvious explanation. The sun exposure is similar. There's no volcanic activity in the area, no hot springs that you can detect. Yet the temperature difference is consistent and measurable. You also notice that the vegetation is different inside the valley. Species that shouldn't grow at this altitude are thriving here, including what looks like a fruit tree, though the season is wrong for identifying it definitely. The biodiversity is notably higher than the surrounding area. Again, this could be explained by the warmer microclimate, but it's still unusual enough to be worth documenting. By late afternoon, you've completed your initial survey. You have photographs, notes, samples, and a growing sense of unease. These ruins represent a significant archaeological site, possibly containing information about early human settlement in Central Asia. They should be studied by experts, documented properly, preserved. But the political realities of 1958 Soviet Union, combined with the sensitive location and your assigned mission, make official reporting problematic at best. You're preparing to leave when you notice something that changes everything. On the northern wall of the valley, partially concealed by vegetation, there's an opening. Not natural. The edges are too regular, clearly worked by human hands. A cave entrance, or possibly a tunnel. You approach carefully, alert for structural instability or dangerous wildlife. The opening is about 2 meters high and 1 meter wide, leading into darkness beyond the reach of daylight. You have a flashlight, standard equipment for geological fieldwork. You click it on and peer inside. The beam reveals worked stone, a tunnel descending into the cliff face, walls smoothed and fitted with the same precision you observed in the ruins above. You know you should leave this for proper archaeological investigation. You know that exploring alone, without proper equipment or support, violates basic safety protocols. But you're also intensely curious, and you might never get another chance to investigate this site. So you enter the tunnel, moving slowly, testing each step. keeping one hand on the wall for orientation. The tunnel descends at a moderate angle for perhaps 50 meters, then levels out. The air is cool but not cold. Dry, with a faint smell you can't identify. Something like old paper or dried herbs. Your flashlight beam illuminates walls covered with more of those carved marks, running in continuous bands along both sides of the tunnel. These are more elaborate than the marks on the platform above. Clearly linguistic, arranged in columns and rows that suggest formal text rather than casual inscriptions. The tunnel ends in a chamber, roughly circular, perhaps 10 meters in diameter. And the chamber is not empty. The walls are lined with stone shelves, and the shelves contain objects. Clay tablets, hundreds of them, arranged systematically. Bundles of what might be preserved plant material. Bark, reeds, something organic that your flashlight beam doesn't adequately illuminate. Stone tools, precisely crafted, laid out in careful arrangements. And in the center of the chamber, a stone pedestal supporting what appears to be an astronomical instrument. Circles of carved stone that can rotate relative to each other, marked with symbols and degrees, clearly designed for calculating or observing something celestial. You stand frozen, trying to process what you're seeing. This isn't just a ruin. This is an archive, a library, a deliberate attempt to preserve knowledge. The tablets are protected from weather, arranged systematically, clearly meant to be found and read by someone. The astronomical instrument is sophisticated, more advanced than you would expect from a culture that supposedly existed before recorded history in this region. You approach the nearest shelf and carefully examine one of the tablets. The surface is covered with precise marks, clearly writing, in a script you don't recognize. It's not Cyrillic, not Chinese, not Arabic, not any modern script you know. But it's clearly systematic, clearly linguistic, with repeated symbols arranged in patterns that suggest grammar and syntax. You're not qualified to translate this. You're not even qualified to properly document it. What you're looking at requires expertise in linguistics, archaeology, ancient history, fields far outside your training. But you're also acutely aware that you might be the only person to see this in centuries. If you don't document it now, if you don't preserve some record of what's here, political circumstances might prevent anyone else from having the opportunity. So you do what you can. You photograph extensively, using multiple rolls of film, capturing the chamber's layout, the arrangement of materials, close-ups of individual tablets, details of the astronomical instrument. You work carefully, touching as little as possible, trying to preserve the site's integrity while gathering evidence of its existence. As you photograph, you notice patterns. The tablets appear to be organized by subject. One section seems to contain astronomical observations, another possibly medical texts, another what might be historical chronicles. The organization suggests curators, people who systematically arrange this material for future reference. And the preservation suggests they succeeded. Despite whatever time has passed, these tablets are intact, readable, waiting for someone with the right expertise to interpret them. You're so focused on documenting that you almost miss the most significant detail. In a small alcove at the back of the chamber, separate from the main collection, there's a stone box. The box is sealed, its lid fitted precisely to the base, with what appears to be some kind of resin or wax around the edges to keep it airtight. And on the lid, carved in clear, deliberate strokes, is a symbol you do recognize. The swastika. Not the tilted Nazi symbol, but the original Buddhist and Hindu version. Arms bent at right angles, a symbol that predates Nazi Germany by millennia and appears throughout Asia as a religious and cultural mark. But in 1958, Soviet Union, any swastika is politically charged, And finding one here, in a hidden chamber in a sensitive border region, makes this situation even more complicated. You photograph the box from multiple angles, but you don't open it. Whatever is inside has been sealed for preservation, and opening it without proper preparation might damage the contents. You note its location, dimensions, the exact nature of the seal, the carved symbols, and you wonder what could be so important that it required special protection beyond the archive's general preservation measures. After 2 hours in the chamber, you reluctantly decide you must leave. Your film is nearly exhausted, daylight is fading, and you have no provisions for overnight stay in the valley. You mark the tunnel entrance carefully on your map, take final photographs of the exterior ruins, and make your way back through the gap in the cliffs to where you've established your survey camp. That night, by lamplight in your tent, you write detailed notes about everything you observed. You describe the valley's location using geological landmarks and coordinates. Document the ruins' features. List the archive chamber's contents as thoroughly as you can from memory. You seal your notes and film in a waterproof container, separate from your official survey materials, and you try to decide what to do next. The obvious course is to report this to the Soviet Academy of Sciences, to arrange for proper archaeological investigation, to ensure these materials are studied by qualified experts. But you know how Soviet bureaucracy works. Such a report would trigger multiple investigations, not just archaeological, but political, military, administrative. The site would be classified, access controlled, results suppressed if they didn't align with official historical narratives. The knowledge might be preserved, but it wouldn't be shared, wouldn't contribute to broader understanding of human history. The alternative is to document it privately, to share your findings with scholars you trust, to try to get this information to people who can interpret it properly without going through official channels. But that carries risks. Accusations of withholding strategic information, possible charges of espionage if your communications are intercepted, professional ruin at minimum. You could lose your position, your career, possibly your freedom. Or you could do nothing. Seal your notes away, continue your survey work, pretend you found nothing unusual in that valley. The archive has survived for centuries without modern science knowing about it. It will continue to survive, waiting for someone else to discover it under circumstances that allow proper investigation. You spend 3 sleepless nights weighing these options. During the day, you continue your mineral survey, collecting samples, filing reports about uranium deposits and rare earth elements. But mentally, you're still in that chamber, still trying to understand what you found and what it means. On the 4th night, you make a decision. You'll complete your survey assignment, return to Moscow, and quietly share your findings with one person. Your former mentor, Professor Dmitry Orlov, a geologist with interests in archaeology who you trust to handle sensitive information carefully. You'll give him your notes and photographs. Let him decide whether and how to pursue this further. You'll protect yourself by not filing official reports, but you'll ensure the knowledge doesn't die with you. It's a compromise, neither fully honest nor fully covert, but it's the best option you can devise, given the constraints you're operating under. You spend the remaining weeks of your survey expedition completing your assigned work, collecting your official samples, filing your official reports. You don't return to the hidden valley. Doing so would create a pattern of visits that might be noticed and questioned. But you mark its location carefully in your personal records, encrypted in a code only Professor Orlov will recognize. 3 months later, back in Moscow, you meet Professor Orlov in his office at the university. You give him the sealed container with your notes and photographs, explain what you found, describe the chamber and its contents. Orlov listens without interrupting, his expression carefully neutral. When you finish, he's quiet for a long time. Finally, he speaks. You've found something significant, possibly extraordinarily significant, but also something that's going to be very difficult to investigate properly, given where it is and what it might mean politically. What do you think it is? You ask. What kind of culture creates an archive like that and hides it in a mountain valley? Orlov shakes his head slowly. I don't know. But I can tell you that there are stories, legends really, about knowledge preservation systems in Central Asia. Networks of scholars who maintained libraries and observatories through periods of political chaos, who deliberately concealed important texts to protect them from destruction. Some of these legends mention a coordinating center, a place where the most important materials were kept, hidden in mountains where only initiated scholars could find them. Shambhala, you say, remembering half-recalled stories from childhood. Among other names, Orlov agrees. Most scholars dismiss these stories as mythology. But mythology often contains kernels of historical truth, events that were real but became embellished over time. What if there really was a knowledge preservation network? What if they really did create hidden archives to protect important texts? Your valley and its chamber could be evidence of exactly that. But the astronomical instrument, the organization of the tablets, that suggests sophisticated understanding of knowledge management, of systematic preservation. That's not primitive culture. That's advanced civilization. Which raises the question, Orlov continues, of when this archive was created and why it was hidden. The weathering on the structures suggests considerable age, but we'd need carbon dating or other techniques to determine that precisely. The script on the tablets is unfamiliar to me, which could mean it's very old, from before standardized writing systems spread through the region. Or it could mean it's a specialized script used only by certain groups. He pauses, then adds, there's another possibility. What if this archive wasn't created by ancient civilization, but by relatively recent scholarship that was deliberately concealing itself? What if there really is, or was, a network of scholars who operated in secret, preserving knowledge they considered too important or too dangerous to share openly? Hidden archives like this could be part of that network. Repositories for texts that couldn't be kept in public libraries, where they might be destroyed by political upheaval or religious persecution. You consider this. It's a less romantic interpretation than discovering ancient civilization, but possibly more plausible. Central Asia has experienced countless invasions, regime changes, religious conflicts over the past millennium. A network of scholars trying to preserve knowledge through all that chaos might well create hidden archives, might develop systems of concealment and security that have kept these materials protected for centuries. So what do we do? You ask. Orlov is quiet again, thinking. Then, we wait. We can't investigate this properly right now. The political situation doesn't allow it. But things change. Regimes change. In 10 years, 20 years, maybe circumstances will be different. Maybe it will become possible to mount a proper expedition, to study this site with appropriate expertise and resources. Until then, we preserve what you've documented, we keep it safe, and we wait for the right moment. And if that moment never comes, then at least we've documented it. At least someone knows it exists. Knowledge that's written down, that's photographed, that's shared with trusted people. That knowledge can survive even if the original site doesn't. You've done what any good scientist should do. You've observed, documented, and preserved your findings. The rest is beyond your control. You leave Orlov's office with mixed feelings. Relief that you've shared this burden, that someone else now knows and can potentially act on it. Frustration that immediate investigation isn't possible, that this remarkable site will continue to sit hidden and unstudied. And lingering curiosity about what those tablets actually say. What knowledge is preserved in that chamber. What the sealed box contains. Years pass. You continue your geological career, doing good work, building a respectable reputation in your field. You never return to the Altai Mountains, never have another opportunity to visit that hidden valley. Professor Orlov dies in 1967. But before his death, he passes your documentation to another trusted scholar, ensuring the knowledge doesn't die with him. The sealed box of notes and photographs moves from hand to hand, kept safe by people who understand its potential significance, waiting for circumstances that might allow proper investigation. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. Borders open, restrictions ease. International cooperation in archaeology becomes possible in ways it wasn't during the Cold War. You're retired now, living in a small apartment in Moscow. But you still have contacts in the academic world. You hear that someone, you're never told exactly who, has organized an expedition to the Altai region, ostensibly studying early human migration patterns, but actually searching for the valley you described 33 years earlier. They don't find it. Either your coordinates weren't precise enough, or the landscape has changed, or the hidden entrance is too well concealed. Or perhaps they find it but don't report it publicly, choosing to study it quietly, away from the attention that would come with announcing a major archaeological discovery in a politically sensitive region. You never know for certain. What you do know is that your documentation survives. The photographs you took, the notes you wrote, the measurements you recorded, they exist in academic archives, available to scholars who might eventually be able to interpret them, cross-reference them with other discoveries, piece together a more complete picture of how knowledge was preserved in Central Asia across centuries of political turbulence. And sometimes, late at night, you think about that chamber, those tablets, that sealed box with its swastika symbol. You think about the people who created that archive, who carefully organized those materials, who sealed them away for protection. Were they part of some coordinated network, some Shambhala-like system of knowledge preservation, or were they just a small community of scholars doing the best they could to protect texts they valued, creating their own local solution to the universal problem of preserving knowledge through uncertain times? You'll never know for certain. But you take some comfort in having documented what you found, in having shared that knowledge with people who appreciated its significance, and having played a small role in ensuring that even if the original archive is lost or remains hidden, some record of its existence survives. That's all any scholar can do, really. Observe carefully, document faithfully, share responsibly, and hope that someone in the future will be able to build on what you preserved. The Immortals of Shambhala, if they ever existed, weren't people who lived forever. They were systems that survived through changing circumstances by distributing knowledge, creating redundancy, teaching the next generation to value preservation as much as discovery. Your chamber in the Altai Mountains might be one node in such a network, or it might be an isolated anomaly. But either way, it represents the human impulse to preserve understanding against forces that would destroy it. To leave messages for future generations, even when those generators seem impossibly distant or unlikely to arrive. And maybe that's what Shambhala really means. Not a place, not an organization, but a principle. The principle that knowledge is worth protecting, that systematic preservation is possible even in chaos, that small groups of dedicated people can maintain continuity of understanding across centuries of disruption. If that principle is immortal, if it keeps manifesting in different times and places through people who commit to preservation, then perhaps the legends are true in the way that matters most. Not literally true about eternal masters controlling events, but essentially true about the persistence of human efforts to maintain knowledge, to connect past and future, to ensure that what was learned doesn't have to be relearned from scratch by every generation. You work in a building that doesn't officially exist, analyzing patterns that might not be real, searching for connections that could be either profound or imaginary. The year is 2003. You're employed by a Western intelligence agency that you're not permitted to name, and your job title is simply pattern analyst, which tells anyone asking exactly nothing about what you actually do. What you actually do is sort through vast amounts of data: financial transactions, communication intercepts, travel records, academic publications, social media posts, anything digital and collectible, looking for patterns that might indicate coordination, organization, or intention behind seemingly random events. It's tedious work, requiring more patience than brilliance, more systematic methodology than creative insight. Most of the time you find nothing. Occasionally you find something that might be something. Very rarely you find something genuinely significant. Today might be one of those rare days, though you're not yet certain. You're staring at a screen displaying a network diagram, nodes representing individuals or organizations, lines connecting them based on various types of relationships. Financial transfers, communications, shared affiliations, geographic proximity, publication citations. The diagram has been generated by software analyzing 15 years of accumulated data, filtered for a specific set of parameters you've defined based on a hunch that's been developing over months of related research. The hunch started with an academic paper you encountered while researching Central Asian history for an unrelated project. The paper, published by an obscure regional journal, discussed ancient astronomical observations preserved in Tibetan monasteries. Nothing particularly unusual about that. There's a small community of scholars interested in historical astronomy, and they publish regularly about various cultural traditions. What caught your attention was a footnote mentioning that certain monasteries maintained continuous observation protocols extending back over 1,000 years, with data still being actively collected and analyzed. Continuous observation for 1,000 years. That's remarkable enough to be worth a second look. Most scientific institutions barely maintain continuity for decades. The oldest continuously operating scientific organizations in Europe date back a few centuries at most. But here were claims of millennium-long data collection, maintained through political upheavals, invasions, regime changes, religious conflicts, all the forces that normally disrupt institutional continuity. You started tracking citations from that paper, following the network of researchers who referenced it or published related work. Most were academics in relevant fields: astronomy, history of science, religious studies, East Asian studies. Normal scholarly activity, people building on each other's work, citing sources, contributing to collective understanding. But you noticed something odd. A subset of these researchers moved unusually often, working at different institutions every few years, always in locations that gave them access to specific archives or collections. They published regularly, but not prolifically. Always solid work, but never flashy. The kind of scholarship that gets respectful citations without attracting wide attention. And they collaborated across disciplines in ways that seemed unusual. An astronomer co-authoring with a medical historian, a linguist working with a geologist, connections that made sense when you looked at the content of their work, but that didn't fit standard academic career patterns. On its own, this pattern might mean nothing. Academic careers are diverse. Interdisciplinary work is increasingly common. People move for all sorts of personal and professional reasons. But combined with other data points you've been tracking, it started to look potentially significant. You've been monitoring financial flows related to cultural preservation projects in Central Asia. This is part of your agency's interest in regional stability, tracking which organizations are working where and who funds them. Most of the money flows are straightforward. UNESCO grants, foundation donations, government cultural programs, all transparent and publicly documented. But there are some flows that are harder to track. Money moving through networks of small NGOs and individual grants, always technically legal, but opaque in its ultimate purpose and control. Not large amounts, nothing that would trigger financial fraud investigations, but consistent, sustained, supporting activities that align with knowledge preservation, library digitization, archive conservation, student scholarships for studying endangered languages, funding for small museums in remote locations. When you mapped the locations receiving this distributed funding and compared them with the research locations of those mobile academics, you found correlation. Not perfect. Correlation never is with real-world data, but statistically significant. Places where those academics worked tended to receive funding from these opaque sources either before they arrived, preparing ground, or after they left, sustaining work they started. Again, this could be coincidence. Researchers naturally gravitate toward well-funded archives. Funding organizations naturally support locations where good scholarly work happens. Correlation doesn't prove causation, but it's suggestive enough that you've been building a more comprehensive data set, pulling in additional information to see if the pattern holds or dissolves under closer examination. The network diagram you're currently studying is the result of that expanded analysis. It incorporates 10 additional years of data, tracks twice as many individuals, includes financial, academic, and personal networks. And what it shows is a structure that could be either remarkably coherent coordination or a series of coincidences that happen to look coordinated when visualized this way. There are approximately 200 individuals in the network, spread across 40 countries. Most are academics, but not all. The network also includes librarians, curators, private collectors, wealthy individuals who fund cultural preservation, even a few former diplomats and intelligence officers who now work in academic or cultural fields. They're connected by various relationships. Some have co-authored papers, some have worked at the same institutions, though often years apart. Some have received funding from the same sources. Some have communicated regularly through email or academic conferences. The connections are subtle. No single individual is connected to more than 15 others, which is within normal range for academic or professional networks. There's no central node, no obvious leader or coordinator. The structure is distributed, resilient to disruption. Remove any single individual or even cluster of individuals, and the network remains connected through alternate paths. But there are features that make you uneasy, that suggest something more than organic scholarly community. The timing of certain connections is suspiciously opportune. Researchers establishing relationships just before collaborating on projects that require exactly those relationships. Funding arriving just when it's needed for specific preservation efforts. Individuals relocating to positions that give them access to materials that become relevant to network research shortly after. And there are gaps. Periods where individuals drop out of public visibility. No publications, no conference presentations, no digital footprint. Then reappear months or years later in different locations with access to new archives or data sources. During these gaps, Financial records show travel to remote locations, often in Central Asia or the Himalayas. But the purpose is never clearly documented. You've been analyzing this network for 3 months now, adding data, testing hypotheses, trying to determine if what you're seeing is genuine coordination or apophenia, the human tendency to see patterns in random data. The software can identify correlations, but it can't tell you whether those correlations mean anything. That interpretation requires human judgment, with all its potential for error and bias. Your supervisor, a career intelligence analyst named Margaret Chen, stops by your desk mid-afternoon. She's been reviewing your reports, and she has questions. "Walk me through this again," she says, pulling up a chair. "You're suggesting there's a coordinated network of scholars and cultural preservation workers operating internationally with unclear funding.